Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The next syndrome resulting from lesion of the midbrain is Nothnagel syndrome. Nothnagel syndrome, it is also usually due to tumor. And the tumor may involve the dorsal midbrain, dorsal midbrain region of upper part of midbrain. So it will damage or compress some structures, for example, tactile region of midbrain. Number 2, pre-tactile region. Tactile region and pre-tactile region of the midbrain. The oculomotor nucleus. Oculomotor nucleus and vertical gauge center. The red nucleus is not involved. Thus, its signs and symptoms mimic the Parinaud syndrome, which we have already discussed. Its signs and symptoms mimic the Parinaud syndrome, but with few differences. What are the differences? That number 1, fibers of the superior cerebral peduncle are involved in this syndrome. Fibers of superior cerebellar peduncle are involved. This is one difference as compared to the Parinaud syndrome. Number 2, it may be unilateral or bilateral. It may be unilateral or bilateral. These are two differences of the Nothnagel syndrome from Parinaud syndrome. Now, what are its features? of Nothnagel syndrome. Number one, there is ipsilateral or bilateral third nerve palsy. Ipsilateral or bilateral third nerve palsy, oculomotor nerve palsy. Third nerve or oculomotor nerve palsy on the same side. Maybe bilateral. Now, what are the features of this third nerve palsy? We, in the previous lecture, discussed these features of the third nerve palsy many times. Briefly, I will revise. Remember 4 Ds. Four Ds. Four Ds, that is downward and outward position of the eyeball. And outward position of eyeball. Number 2, diplopia, double vision. Downward and outward position of the eyeball. The eyeball is deviated downwards and laterally. Second, double vision. Diplopia, then dilated pupil, dilated and fixed pupil. And the drooping of the upper eyelid. Drooping of the upper eyelid. So because the third nerve palsy involve majority of the extraocular muscle, so because the lateral rectus muscle is unopposed, and also the this lateral rectus muscle move the eyeball outwards, abduct the eyeball, and because of this there is squint or strabismus, and due to it there is double vision, diplopia. Then the pupils become dilated, and because the dilated pupillary muscle is unopposed and dilates the pupil. Next, drooping of the upper eyelids. The upper eyelid are drooped down. Because of the levator papillae superioris muscle. The motor part of the levator papillae superioris muscle is paralyzed, resulting in drooping of the upper eyelid. So these are the features of ipsilateral, bilateral, ipsilateral or bilateral third nerve palsy occurring in case of this Nothnagel syndrome. Is the lesion involved the superior cerebral peduncle also. The lesion involves superior cerebral peduncle. You know, the right superior cerebral peduncle connect the right cerebellar hemisphere with the left red nucleus, while the left superior cerebellar peduncle it connect the left cerebellar hemisphere with the right red nucleus. So because of involvement of the superior cerebellar peduncle, it results in the cerebellar ataxia. Then the vertical gauze defects. Because of involvement of the vertical gauze center, that is interstitial nucleus of a Kajal. So vertical gauze defects. So this was briefly about the Nothnagel syndrome, which in most of the respect resemble the Parinaud syndrome, and the differences are these two, that superior, apart from oculomotor nerve involvement, and the gauze center involvement, it also involves the fibers of the superior cerebral peduncle, and it may be unilateral or bilateral. Next, Horner's syndrome. Horner's syndrome. Now there is a descending autonomic or sympathetic pathway. Descending sympathetic pathway. So lesion of this pathway anywhere in the midbrain, it results in Horner's syndrome. Draw front view. This is for example, section through right cerebral hemisphere and section through left cerebral hemisphere. There is a midbrain. Pons. Medulla oblongata. which is continued as spinal cord below. Spinal cord. Now here in each cerebral hemisphere, it is hypothalamus. Suppose this is hypothalamus. And above and behind is the thalamus. Cerebral cortex, midbrain, crus cerebri. Now from the posterior part of the hypothalamus or posterior nucleus of the hypothalamus, a bundle of nerve fibers arise which descend through the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. From the medulla oblongata, it enters the spinal cord, traverses the cervical segments of the spinal cord, and enters the thoracic. Cervical part of spinal cord. And this is the thoracic. Part of spinal cord. Now here starts the T1. First thoracic spinal segment. T1. Cervical segments, when they end, then it starts with T1 segment. Now here if we cut a section through the spinal cord, this is anterior median fissure, anterolateral sulcus, posterolateral sulcus, a section through spinal cord. T1 segment of the spinal cord. Central canal. The gray matter in the form of anterior arm lateral horn and posterior horn. Anterior gray column, and this is lateral or intermediate gray column. Central canal. So what is this? Lateral or intermediate gray column of spinal cord. Sympathetic nervous system is thoracolumbar innervasion. So all the thoracic segment and upper 2 or 3 lumbar region has an additional gray column known as the lateral or intermediate gray column. Throughout the spinal cord are anterior horn and posterior horn, anterior and posterior gray column. But in the thoracolumbar region, all thoracic spinal segments and first 2 or 3 lumbar region, there is an additional column of gray matter known as the lateral or intermediate. Here there are neurons which belong to this sympathetic nervous system. So these bundle of fibers, they terminate in the intermediate or lateral horn, in which there is ciliospinal center. In lateral horn or lateral gray column. Ciliospinal center. Located in the T1, in lateral horn of T1 spinal segment. Of spinal cord, thoracic 1 spinal cord. So a bundle of nerve fibers arise from the posterior part of the hypothalamus. Posterior part of hypothalamus. This is hypothalamus and small part of the thalamus. You can see on each side, diencephalon. So a bundle of nerve fibers arise from the posterior part of the hypothalamus or posterior nucleus of the hypothalamus. Remember the posterior hypothalamus or posterior nucleus of the thalamus and anterior hypothalamus or anterior nucleus of the hypothalamus. Posterior part of the hypothalamus controls sympathetic nervous system. while the anterior hypothalamus, it controls the parasympathetic. Control parasympathetic nervous system. So we are dealing with the Horner syndrome. So here we are concerned with the posterior hypothalamus or posterior nucleus of the hypothalamus, which controls the sympathetic nervous system. Posterior hypothalamus. So a bundle of fibers arise from the posterior nucleus of hypothalamus or posterior hypothalamus. It descends posterolaterally throughout the brainstem. That is posterolaterally in the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Enter the spinal cord and continue to descend through the cervical part of the spinal cord, and where the bundle of fibers end in the ciliospinal center of T1 spinal segment, which is located in the lateral horn of all thoracic segments. Here I have drawn T1 section through T1 segment of the spinal cord. So the lateral and intermediate horn of the T1 segment have a center called ciliospinal segment. On this bundle of autonomic fibers, that is sympathetic fibers, they terminate at the ciliospinal center located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Now, what is this? This is descending autonomic fibers. Descending autonomic, that is sympathetic. Fibers. Where it starts from the posterior hypothalamus, which control the sympathetic nervous system. This bundle of fiber descend through the brainstem posterolaterally through the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, continue to descend through the cervical part of the spinal cord, enter the first thoracic spinal segment, where these fibers make synapse with the ciliospinal center, which is located in the lateral and intermediate horn of T1 spinal segment. So this is one side, and then on the other side, again, same descending autonomic fibers arising from posterior hypothalamus. So we are discussing the Horner's syndrome. Now, lesion anywhere in this descending sympathetic pathway from posterior hypothalamus down to the T1 spinal segment, lateral horn having ciliospinal center. Lesion anywhere. So here we are discussing with the syndromes or lesions affecting the midbrain. So if in the midbrain region this descending pathway is damaged, it will result in a condition known as the Horner syndrome. The sympathetic fibers are damaged, sympathetic nervous system. Now it is ipsilateral. All these effects are lesion effects in case of Horner syndrome are ipsilateral. Now, what will be the signs and symptoms of lesion of this descending sympathetic path extending from posterior hypothalamus down to the lateral gray column of the T1 spinal segment, that is up to the ciliospinal center located in this lateral horn of T1 segment. Now, what will be its effects? All the lesion effects are ipsilateral. Number one, there will be miosis, that is pupillary constriction. The pupil will constrict. You know, the iris has dilator pupillary muscle and constrictor pupillary muscle. The sympathetic nervous system innervate the dilator pupillae. So when the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, the pupil will dilate, while the constrictor pupillae muscle is innervated by parasympathetic nervous system. So if the parasympathetic nervous system is stimulated, the pupil will dilate. So in Horner syndrome, what happens? That the sympathetic innervation is lost. So when the sympathetic innervation is lost, it means the dilator pupillary muscle is paralyzed. Because the constrictor pupillary muscle supplied with parasympathetic nervous system is intact, therefore the constrictor pupillary muscle will be unopposed and it will result in constriction of the pupil in case of Horner syndrome. So pupil cannot be dilated because the dilator pupillae is innervated by sympathetic system, which in the Horner syndrome is damaged, anywhere damaged in this descending pathway. Second, pseudoptosis. That is a partial ptosis of upper eyelid. You know, the upper eyelid muscle, the upper eyelid has a muscle known as the levator palpebrae superioris. And I told you this levator palpebrae superioris muscle comprised of smooth muscle part and skeletal muscle part. Smooth muscle part is also known as Muller's muscle. Smooth muscle part. The smooth muscle part of the levator palpebrae superioris and skeletal. The skeletal part is innervated by oculomotor nerve, while the smooth muscle part, it is innervated by sympathetic nerves. Sympathetic nerve fibers. So because in the Horner syndrome, the sympathetic pathway is damaged, therefore the smooth muscle part or Muller muscles of the upper eyelid will be paralyzed because of lack of sympathetic innervation. Now, because the skeletal muscle part is innervated by oculomotor nerve, therefore the ptosis will occur, but this ptosis will be partial ptosis, not complete ptosis, because only the smooth muscle part or Muller's muscle of the upper eyelid is paralyzed. So it will result in partial ptosis of the upper eyelid, also known as the pseudoptosis. Pseudo means false. False ptosis. So this was the second feature of the Horner syndrome. Third, enophthalmos, sinking of the eyeball. Enophthalmos. It means sinking of eyeballs. will occur in case of this Horner syndrome. Then there will be anhidrosis. Anhidrosis, defective sweating or decreased sweating. On the affected side. Next is the increased warmth. Increased warmth and redness of the skin. On the affected side, due to loss of sympathetic vasoconstriction. It is due to what? Due to loss of sympathetic vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction. The blood vessel will fail to constrict. Therefore, the blood vessel will be dilated. When the blood vessels will be dilated, there will be more flow of blood through the skin. Because there is more flow of blood through the skin, therefore the skin will become warm. And because there is more flow of blood through the skin, it will give a reddish color, so redness of the skin. So these are all features of the Horner syndrome. In case when this descending autonomic pathway or sympathetic pathway is damaged anywhere. So because this sympathetic pathway is also traversing the midbrain, and we are talking about the lesions of the midbrain. So when this pathway is damaged during its course through the midbrain, it will also result in this condition known as the Horner's syndrome. Now, next to Horner syndrome is the midbrain reticular formation damage. Midbrain reticular formation. Lesion or damage. You know, reticular formation traverses throughout the brainstem. So if that part of the reticular formation traversing the midbrain is damaged, it will also cause some signs and symptoms. So what is the role of reticular formation? Reticular formation has role in arousal. Reticular formation has a role in arousal. Arousal and state of alertness of the individual, and state of alertness keep the person alert, conscious. This is the main role of the reticular formation, which have already we discussed in the previous lecture in detail. So when there is a unilateral lesion of reticular formation, in the midbrain, it will result in what? If there is bilateral, not a unilateral, bilateral. If there is bilateral if there is bilateral lesion of the reticular formation traversing the midbrain, it will be associated with coma. Associated with coma. What is coma? It is a state of sustained unconsciousness. Coma is a state of sustained. It is a state of sustained unconsciousness and unresponsiveness. Unconsciousness and unresponsiveness. Because the normal function of reticular formation is to keep a person alert, responsible for arousal and state of alertness of an individual. So this will be the effect of reticular formation lesion traversing through the midbrain. Next important lesion related to the midbrain is a herniation of Uncus. Herniation of Uncus. Through tentorial notch. Through tentorial notch of falx. Through tentorial notch of Tentorium cerebelli. Now, what is Tentorium cerebelli? You know the dural folds. Now, some major dural folds I will draw a three-dimensional view of. This is a dural fold in the cranial cavity lodged between the two cerebral hemispheres through longitudinal fissure. When two major tentorial folds are dissected out from the cranial cavity, and explained in this diagram. Now this vertically running dural fold is known as the falx cerebri. And this one is called Tentorium cerebelli. 10 shape. Tentorium cerebelli, horizontally located. This is one wing of the tentorium cerebelli and this is the opposite wing. And in the center there is a gap. This is called tentorial notch. This is tentorial notch. There is a notch between the two wings of tentorium cerebelli. And from the middle of the upper surface of this 10 shaped, the tentorium cerebelli is the falx cerebri. The falx cerebri descend through the longitudinal fissure, partially separating the right and left cerebral hemisphere, while the tentorium cerebelli is between the cerebrum above and cerebellum below, and through it midbrain traverses. Midbrain passes through tentorium cerebelli. Midbrain passes through tentorium cerebelli. Now if we cut a horizontal section through the skull, just above the tentorium cerebelli, so how it will appear? For example, this is a section through the horizontal section through the skull. This is the cut edge of the skull, exposing the cranial cavity. Horizontal section through the skull. This is cranial cavity, and this section is at the level of at a level just above the tentorium cerebelli. Now here is the floor of the anterior fossa. These are lesser wings. This is cribriform plate of ethmoid bone, lesser wing, then clinoid process. Here is body of the sphenoid bone. This is the body of the sphenoid bone, suppose. Now here is tentorium cerebelli, superior surface. The attachments of the tentorium cerebelli. This is tentorium cerebelli, superior surface. This is skull section. Horizontal section. skull. And this is tentorial notch. Tentorial notch. Now through it passes the midbrain. Midbrain connecting the forebrain with the hindbrain. Now, herniation of the uncus. What is uncus? If we cut a section through the midline section, to the corpus callosum, separating the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Now in the midline, corpus callosum is cut. This is corpus callosum comprising of rostrum, genu, body and splenium. And here is the fornix, and you know the septum pellucidum. There are different sulci. So around this cut end of the corpus callosum, there are some gyri. For example, here is cingulate gyrus. Already we discussed these in the midline structure while we were talking about the external features of the brain. This is cingulate gyrus. Then there is isthmus. Then there is parahippocampal gyrus. Parahippocampal gyrus. Then anteriorly there is a hook-shaped gyrus known as the uncus. Uncus. Uncus, part of the temporal lobe, uncus. So here you know there is a midbrain which passes through the tentorial notch. So on the medial surface is the uncus. Now when there is a herniation of the uncus, naturally it will compress the structures passing through the midbrain. Now suppose on this side, this is uncus which is herniated. Herniated uncus. into the tentorial notch. And you know the tentorial notch, this tentorial notch is traversed by the midbrain. So naturally, this herniated part of the uncus, it will compress the midbrain. Now this is midbrain, which is compressed by the uncus. Compressed midbrain. It will compress the herniated uncus, will herniate into the tentorial notch, or because the midbrain traverses the tentorial notch, therefore this extension or herniation of the uncus will compress the midbrain to one side against the edges of the tentorial notch of the cerebellum. So herniation of the uncus through the tentorial notch of tentorium cerebelli may compress the midbrain to one side. What will be its effects? When the midbrain is compressed from one side by herniated uncus, which is on the medial surface of the temporal lobe, and when it is herniated through the tentorial notch, naturally it will compress the midbrain to one side against the sharp edge of the tentorial notch. It will result in compression of the oculomotor nerve. What will be its effects? Compression of oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor nerve will be compressed, leading to ipsilateral dilated pupil. Leading to ipsilateral dilated pupil. Number two, compression of corticospinal fibers in opposite crus. Compression of opposite corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract will be compressed in opposite crus cerebri. Compression of corticospinal tract. Corticospinal tract in opposite crus cerebri of midbrain. When it will compress, when the uncus will compress the midbrain against the edge of the tentorium cerebelli, so this is the crus cerebri of the same side and this is crus cerebri of the opposite side. So the corticospinal tract through the opposite crest cerebri will be compressed. By the free edge of the tentorial cerebri, it will lead to ipsilateral hemiplegia, leading to ipsilateral hemiplegia. Number one, result in the ipsilateral dilated pupil due to oculomotor nerve compression, and second, due to compression of the corticospinal tract in the opposite crest cerebri, it will lead into the ipsilateral hemiplegia. Ipsilateral hemiplegia on the side where the corticospinal tract are compressed. Then next, it will result compression of posterior cerebral artery. Number three, compression of posterior cerebral cerebral artery. It will lead to infarction of occipital lobe, leading to infarction of occipital lobe of cerebrum. Now, because the visual center is in the occipital lobe, posterior pole, it will result in homonymous hemianopia. Homonymous hemianopia. So these will be the effects of herniation of the Uncus of the temporal lobe, compressing the midbrain to the opposite side against the sharp edge of the tentorial notch of Tentorium cerebelli. So these were the effects of lesions of the midbrain, and we have finished with all the lesions which are important, clinically important, and are also very important as far as the exam is concerned. Thank you very much. Please keep learning.